And I want to thank the Henry for hosting us and all the great help they've given us in planning this, and thank you all for being here. I'm Marci, Director of the Museology Graduate Program. Lewis Hyde suggests that culture lies in the boundaries, and that the liveliness of a culture depends on having those boundaries often disrupted. Anything sound familiar here? Most vibrant and enduring cultures have stories of a trickster whose function is to uncover and disrupt the very things that culture is based on. During that disruption, as society attempts to distinguish between right and wrong, living and dead, sacred and profane, male and female, the trickster crosses the line back and forth, confusing the distinctions, drawing us back and forth across the line. And ultimately, we're left with a more profound and nuanced understanding of the boundaries of who we are and our relationships with those boundaries. Knowing the impact of Elaine's work and the way she likes to work, I would be really tempted to call her a trickster, but not knowing her quite well enough personally, instead I'll just call her a boundary crosser. Somebody that does cross the line often and provokes us to think about what that line is and why that line is actually there. This work that she's done has led her to many places. Her ability to cross boundaries has led her to consult and advise museums that are beginning, building, or reinventing themselves in places across the world. Most of them I can't pronounce, but some of them, such as London, the Dominican Republic, Berlin, Guatemala, Dubai, and many other places. She was inducted as one of the 100 Centennial Honor Roll members of the American Association of Museums. She has served in a range of positions, from Deputy Assistant Secretary for Museums at the Smithsonian to Director of Exhibit Center in Boston Children's Museum, and many, many, many other places. I am most pleased to honor and recognize the work she's done to mentor and guide and excite young students and young professionals. She was a visiting scholar at the University of Michigan, and she is or will be a Fulbright Scholar for training museum professionals in Argentina. Was. And before I turn the microphone over to her and welcome her most heartily, I just want to remind you all of the reception afterwards. And tomorrow there will be a brown bag at the Burke Museum classroom at 11:30. So if you want to continue this conversation, or if you know people that weren't able to be here today, but you know they absolutely have to have a chance to talk with Elaine, you'll have a chance there. So with that, I will turn the microphone over to Elaine. Thank you.
There's a mic here, so I'll turn this one on later, or you need me to turn this one on now? I can leave this one on, is that right? And I'll turn this one on when I ask you questions. Hi. I'd love to be called a trickster. Nobody ever offered that before. My father would be appalled, but my mother would understand, so that's okay. I wish to acknowledge the original owners of this land. That's the opening in Australia that any public speaker makes. And it seems to me an appropriate opening here. They usually then name the original owners of this land, but I suspect that there are many people who are the original owners of this land. There's a paper that's been advertised that I'm going to talk about called Being the Third on Your Block. And in fact, I'll read you sections of this paper, but some of you have to read it for class. How many of you is that? Have read it? Have read it? Kind of have read it. Oh, I love that. That's good. You won't have to read it at the end of this, though. It'll be all right. There's a couple of things I tell every class, and it's kind of truth in lending, so I need to tell you. I'm 74 years old. I have many children. Some of them are in the audience. Some married. He's in the audience. he's much more interesting to talk to than I am. That's Dean Anderson sitting here. I was born in the United States of German Jewish immigrant parents. I was born in 1937, and the Holocaust began about 1939 or 40 when people, but from starting with 1931, my family began to try and get people to come here. My family had come in the late 20s, and they managed to bring the central portion of my family together. And I was raised in Queens, New York. Those things are important because people under stress do not necessarily think that the public facilities are facilities meant to them and are terrified of them. I spent my entire career hoping I could build a museum my mother would have come to voluntarily. And that is the leitmotif of my entire career. I started my career in museum land. I was an art teacher in the elementary school. I started my career in the museum community 1 year after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I have, from both my family experience and from that experience, understood that museums really are potentially places for us all. We, after all, own the stuff, and it is our patrimony, but it is not and has never been wholesale the way in which museums run themselves. So while they should be for all of us, they are sadly not. When I started my career, I believed that it was inadvertence, wide-eyed and bushy-tailed as I was, that only if we all knew more about welcome and the intricacies of welcome, we would all recreate our institutions in a welcoming manner. This is the twilight of my career, and I am less hopeful 40 years later than I was when I began. So if that's a downer to all of you, my apologies. And I've spent these 40 years trying to figure out how it is that change could happen in the direction of what we euphemistically call inclusion and what I rather call welcome. How can we make these institutions feel like everyone who enters knows that they were meant to enter? And what are the tiny, multiple things that have to happen that allow that to happen? It turns out that as I've spent a lifetime looking at it, the things that you have to do are subtle, multiple, and that there are not single bullets. And the most important thing for me to have learned is that everybody is not waiting with their nose pressed against the window hoping to be invited in, and that all you have to do is invite them. There will be throngs of them rushing to you. It doesn't work that way. It depends on how they were raised. It depends on their relationship to the institutions in general, and yours in particular. But the things you do have control about are intentionality. And intentionality is not only in your control, but varies from institution to institution. Let me start with the part of the paper which talks about what I think museums have as a core competency, and it may surprise some of you. Museums have two important civic assets whose combination is shared by some but few other institutions. They have specialized spaces constructed to allow strangers to safely congregate, and they present three-dimensional evidence that the public finds worth contemplating. So, specialized spaces is one, and three-dimensional evidence is the other. And you'll notice I didn't say collections. Museums are places where the combination of human beings, mostly strangers, can come face to face with three-dimensional realia, some of it real, some of it not real. And it is that interaction So it is not the website, I'm at home interaction, which is an important interaction, but that's not the primary interaction that interests me. Is the interaction between people and people and three-dimensional evidence that we have. But so do hardware stores. And I think hardware stores and we have some different intentionality, but serve an equal and albeit equally important purpose. So I'm really interested in airports. I'm interested in train stations where multiple intention for the people to come in, but they all leave, at least one hopes, they all leave safe at the end and have come to their destination. Multiple intentions is one of the things that's incredibly important to museums, both our intention and the visitors, and since the visitors are anonymous to us, we have a very complex job about what does welcome look like with multiple intentions that we don't know about. In this quest in 2001, I wrote a paper called Choosing. And there's paper up there because I thought when we start to ask questions and stuff, I'll write some things, and maybe I'll write this, but maybe I won't. Choosing Among the Options is a paper about intentionality, and it suggests that museums, regardless of their content direction, can choose from 5 different intentions. Only 2 of them are object-centered. One of them is object-centered museums. This is the stuff. We're all coming to see it. One of them is narrative, which is where the stuff has been put together in a story arc, so it's things as illustrations, no less things. One of them is client-centered, and client-centered museums, mostly children's museums and science museums, are interested in learning theory, and their client is really a social universe, children and their caregivers, humans who interact with each other. One is community museums, where their intention is about the welfare of a much larger unit than the social unit of families. And the last one is government museums, which in the paper I refer to as national museums, where in certain ways the client is the government and the people are in some ways tools. The government understands that in these museums, their aspirations will be made real and visible. And that means the fights that happen, for example, the Enola Gay fight about the meaning of the Second World War, might not have happened in any other institution. And if you go back and read the Enola Gay stuff, first of all, you have to understand the Enola Gay controversy happened by somebody leaking a material from an advisory committee. So speeches that happened in the Hill from Congress about the Enola Gay exhibition were about a non-existent exhibition. That the exhibition did not happen until the controversy died down, at which point they took out the Enola Gay fuselage and put up a sign which said, "This is the Enola Gay." It was used to drop the bomb on Hiroshima on such and such a date, the end. That was what had happened. And what had happened as a result of the Enola Gay controversy, which is a fight over a non-existent museum in the corridors of American politics, was that all over the world, government museums became even more cautious than they had been before. So that's the 5th. I work mostly with government museums. I'm very mindful about what is going on, but most of my writing and my thinking is about the other 4. Now that's a construct. It's a categorization that doesn't exist in reality. All museums are really a hybrid museum, but it's a useful category in which you can ask yourself a couple of questions. I suggested that museums widely defined were not as homogeneous as people assumed, the direction of a museum decided to take was not, I suggested, based on the subject matter of their collection, but rather on the philosophy of their director, staff, and board, and sometimes, but not always, expressed in their mission statement. I postulated in that paper that there were 5 different, often overlapping intentions, the ones I've just given you. But you could find out where a museum lies by asking 2 fundamental questions. Which does the museum value more, visitors or objects? And second, is the museum primarily an instructor to or a collaborator with their audience? And even though most museum staff will answer that their museums value both visitors and content equally, and that institutions are simultaneously a civic meeting place and a place of instructions, usually one or the other of these tendencies predominates when placed on a continuum. Now, choosing is a very big, long paper in which it tells you which one of which influenced the other. So what was a client-centered organization doing interested in learning theory that then virally got transposed other places? So if you want to know that, go read that, but it's not here. While object-based museums are more guided by their stuff, the narrative museum is more interested in the story. But both of these, as you will hear me talk about, tend to be classicist museums. And it's a classicist and inclusionist is what the paper I am going to talk about is about. If, on the other hand, the museum wishes to be primarily responsive to those that use it, then the museum will probably fall into the category of client-centered or community-focused. Even if it collects many wonderful collection items, these museums I would term the inclusionists. The difference is that client-centered museums tend to think of users as individuals, small social groups, or families, while community-focused museums focus on a larger group. I have found all of these to be inexact definitions, understanding that all museums are hybrids. Okay. So that was a paper I wrote in 2001. But it didn't satisfy me because as I continued in my work, you're watching me put my paper together again. I was completely struck by the fact that I'd now been in the business for a very long time, and most museums hadn't changed at all. And I was forced to get to the place of trying to figure that out. And that is what this paper attempts to do. But I was left with the notion that they didn't change at all, not from lack of experience, but from intentionality. That they didn't wish to change, and they didn't have to change. And then I was left with a sentence my husband has heard me say all the time, that those of the most iconoclastic museums and people got to be more and more famous as an alternative to fame, as an alternative to change. So if your motivation for sitting here and listening to me is so that you don't have to do anything, you will join a legion of others who have come to listen to me. It's a witnessing that I've spent a lifetime doing. And all of us know all the very change agent museums, kamikaze museums, I sometimes refer to them. They get incredibly famous, but they don't get incredibly famous as a viral thing, like I saw it there and we should do that. But indeed, there is a process that then happens, and that's the process I want to talk about. In museum work, we find people who have chosen their careers based on their individual philosophy, lifestyle, and interest. Their choice of profession is often very specific and has often been committed to from a very early age. Choosing to work in museums is certainly not based on the remuneration, since most of the administrative level salaries is relatively low when compared to the pay similarly educated people might get elsewhere. You certainly all know that. You've made a decision to enter a field in which money, though it'll be a living wage, will not be the major outcome. Rich will not be the end. And so it comes from a decision of the heart. The numerical availability of museum-related jobs is small and hotly contested because there are more people who are trained for museum work than there are jobs. And I know you're struggling with that now. I conclude that most workers are self-selected based on a mix of personal reasons, which include the role museums have played in their lives, a commitment to the nobility of the work itself, and pleasure with the position they hold in society because of it. This is especially true of those who choose employment in the specialized museum functions, curation, museum education, exhibition development, and collections care, for example, and the rest of the staff who have transferable skills and who come from other industries are often surprised when they unexpectedly find themselves in a museum. These people often stay for the same reasons that the others chose it in the first place. And therefore, it's not surprising that individual museum staff members can appear to be messianic protectors of the institution devoted to defending the very description of museums as they grew up in and as they envision. Their personal characterization of appropriate museum activity is often tied, I believe, to their view of themselves as guardians of the patrimony for a future generation and as the benign enlightener of the current visitor. These staff envision themselves standing at the barricades, fighting against those who, like me, wish to propose change because we present a divergent description of the genre museums. These self-important custodians fear, sometimes correctly, that we are advocating the transformation of institutions they love into something they no longer recognize. They feel in all sincerity that their opponents, myself included, are misguided. So again, if you join the Legion who believe that that was a nice talk, but not what you came for, you will not be alone. Now, in my older age, I am surprised that I sometimes think that these defenders for being resistant, that I sometimes thank these defendants for being resistant. A funny position for one who has advanced inclusionary change for nearly 40 years. So let me confess that I find the object-based temple of the contemplative, the places I have so long sought to change, such as the Met and the Louvre, divine. Equally surprising to me is that my young grandchildren are also entranced, no matter what their age or their prior subject matter. For all of us, going to the Met is indeed like entering the rarefied, magical world of our imagination. The journey is closer than I care to admit to the mystical literature favored by these same grandchildren. Entering satisfies our perhaps secret aspirations of being super powerful, super rich, and endowed with superhuman powers, because in some sense, we know these places diverge exotically from our daily environment and reflect more of the values of the people who formerly owned these objects rather than those who made them. And allow me to name these museums the Classicists. These are the object-drenched, gorgeous spaces whose installations have intentionally omitted those explanatory labels that might help most mere mortals. They are the places that are indeed overwhelming and memorable. At the same time, they are exasperating by reducing the uninitiated to feelings of insignificance. The indelibleness of the metropolitan may be based on its indecipherability. There are some smug few who fear, I suggest, that the exclusive ambiance might be compromised if more people understood it. So let me be clear. There are few such classic places so perfect as to be worthy of my total forgiveness. I have not changed beyond recognition. I would still contend that most classic museums do not reach the Met's level of delightful astonishment Instead, they often evoke mystification and ultimate boredom and frustration in their visitors. In contradistinction, there are the exclusionists. There are the inclusionist museums with whom I proudly associate myself, who are committed to inclusion and accessibility, with their insistence on multisensory labels and associations with daily experience. These institutions have intentionally modified and even willfully destroyed the impenetrable atmosphere so treasured by the classicists, but they often give away magic by doing so. These institutions take as their model a more egalitarian political position, asserting the material evidence we call collections belongs to all, and that any systemic change that welcomes the least is for the good. The tensions between the classicists and the includers have existed from almost the beginning of the museums themselves, and they have been side-by-side contemporaneous developments of excellence by each team and in every age. The inclusionist museums tend to be numerically fewer and are often considered generally less powerful than their more traditional siblings. They are often found in categories: children's museums, science museums, culturally specific museums, that the classicists might not consider real museums anyway. The influence of these inclusionary institutions is huge, and then via the acceptance of more flexible members of the classicist class, where the change is sometimes heralded as revolutionary. And that's the sentence that will carry on through the rest of the paper. How does this change happen? Thereafter, there's an acceptance of the self-same techniques by the most reticent, using a process they suggest should be called wanting to be the third on your block. And that's a phrase that may not be... when I grew up, wanting to be the first on your block, hula hoop, bubble gum, was very important. Wanting to be the second on your block was not too good, but being the third on your block was the same as nothing. So it's a phrase of pejorative for me. We're not talking about hula hoops here, but we could be. The approval comes after many others have tried it, most especially after the most supple of the classic museums have incorporated it into their own program. I now understand why so many museums have successfully resisted change. It is because they aspire to remain in the classic camp, most especially aligned with the social elite and reinforced by the stereotype of museums found in movies and literature. A night at the museum does nothing to help me. All those, those little things, wonderful classical things that wake up at night and sing and dance. The lack of basic change among the majority of the world's museums has, I now believe, been intentional, and the resistance to change has been successful overall. It turns out neither the majority of the public nor the powerful have demanded it. Quite the contrary, the controlling stakeholders, be they the social elite, the political official, or the newly rich, have more often funded the classic institutions in preference to the others available in their locale. And these stakeholders have sometimes demanded that those that stray be returned to the fold, teaching other museums the dangers of experimentation. The advocacy of inclusion has remained the province of the political left, the mostly disenfranchised cultural minority, and the free choice educational philosophers. Those advocates usually don't have sufficient political clout to effect wholesale transformation. I would suggest that when the fulsome palette of activities needed for inclusion is offered to a museum, it is seen as overturning the very definition of the institution museum itself, and often is successfully resisted. Given the current stressful world situation and the changing demographics of America, from predominant majority culture to a majority coalition of many minority groups, most classic museums now include some language of inclusion in their vision and mission statements. They have often instituted outreach departments to work with the disadvantaged, and have created engaging and seemingly welcome websites while still protecting a relatively unchanged core. Cynically, it might be suggested that such activities are instituted as an unconscious suck to external pressures so that the core could and can remain inviolate. The actions often remain ancillary, the strategies do not invade the central museum site, and sometimes exude a patronizing feeling that I'm sure the staff did not intentionally plan. Quizzing oneself about the dominant direction your museum intends to take might help you determine your place on the continuum of the inclusion-classic dichotomy. It is probably unfair to think that the user-focused museum is more interested in change and experimentation than their classic sibling, but I would suggest that it is the nature of the inclusionist to experiment with the system that further the comfort zone of the visitors, and in doing so, care less about the museum definition than do their classic siblings. When do museums change, and what is the impetus for change? I now believe that museums transform themselves because, unfortunately, their directors will it. It is more singularly dependent than I would wish. It is more personality-based than I would like. These directors are indefatigable visionaries who know how to go from idea to operation, and eventually those who join him or her share the vision and form a band of believers, a passionate coterie. The director does not have to be born into privilege to crave it, nor born into privation to champion it. Visionaries appear in both museum categories, inclusion and classic. The difference, I would suggest, that those who cause experimentation in more classic categories expand examples seen elsewhere, but do not break the mold of their sector, while the directors in visionary, inclusionary museums defy the traditional boundaries. These are the first of their block, but as directors they're often vulnerable to rejection or can experiment only in museums deemed insignificant enough to be below the radar. Almost all the directors I know who have created experimental institutions have been ultimately fired from those positions, and the institution has been forcibly returned to the fold. So for those of you who are hoping to do this, this is not a strategy for longevity. The classicist director, in proposing changes, wish to move their institution and their field into successive steps that can be emulated by others. They recognize that their museums are incrementalists. They borrow ideas from the more experimental branches of the museum community and choose the ideas that, while not the newest, might be ripe for acceptance. These directors are brave but not foolhardy. They pay with their personal social capital to make changes acceptable. It is because of their clout that these changes are eventually embraced by the other classic museums and are then seen as acceptable, traditional, and timeless. The sector, in emulating the change agent museum, forget or intentionally do not acknowledge the examples from whence the originality came. I would say that as a political move, expanding the acceptable methodology of one's own cohort is smart. It makes the director into an acknowledged pioneer. I admire those directors because those who change the procedures of their class are insistent and valiant. But their aim is to be second, not first, on their block. That would metaphorically make those copiers, those expanders, the third on the block. We are not so surprised when we find new radical museum ideas embedded in brand new museums that have no previous history to live up to, nor when we find them in consciously experimental institutions, where it is both their tradition and almost their obligation. It is when one existent traditional museum morphs into a more flexible museum that we take notice. And having understood there are two streams of museums, the inclusionist and the classicist, or the experimenters and the traditionalists. We are at the point of the paper where we could look at examples, but what I want to do is to tell you what I think the next levels of experimentation will do, and then we'll take questions. Let me point out the areas that I think are undergoing change, and where experimenting museums will be doing their experiments. All of them are intertwined with and affected by multiple contemporary influences. The first is the changing technological landscape and its ramifications, especially in sharing authority with unseen visitors. The second is the economic downturn, which is causing museums, albeit small numbers of museums, to rethink their core competencies and rely more heavily on their local resources, and which could allow some museums to become more relevant to the immediate needs in their community. The third is the more widespread recognition of the importance of group gathering locations known as the third space in community building, and its relevance in making museums forums for debate. The fourth change is the emerging academic interest in more intuitive, less mechanistic systems, which takes human variability into account when causing changes in the world of work, especially in hierarchical employment, and which also makes the distinction between rational and more intuitive and emotive explanations of our research and our exhibitions. The fifth change is caused by the more empowered and successful minority and immigrant communities who are continuing to demand a voice in our governance, collections choices, and exhibition. And finally, the sixth is this growing paucity of place, of the meaning of community, which is decoupling this place from the function. I know that's a little hard to explain, so let me explain it. School is a place. Education is a system. What technology is allowing us to do is to educate without place, or with a combination of place and not place. And that community of what we consider education will build a new community, and we will start to build porous communities in which function rather than location determines what the community is about. So let me read a concluding sentence so at least you'll think there's a conclusion. It's a whole part about curators, but we'll leave that out. In the end, I'm suggesting that there have always been two streams of basic museum philosophy, one that focuses on the needs of the actual and potential audience, and one that focuses on the transmission of knowledge, even while both may have collections of interest. In both cases, the museums in question use three-dimensional evidence to make their case, and in both cases, the museum engenders resistance to change while feeling some impulsion to be responsive. I do not know who will tackle all the issues I've mentioned in the immediate future, but I remained impressed by those who are the originators of change, the first on their block, as well as those directors who violate their class and are brave enough to be the second. And I thank them all, and I thank you for listening. I'll go back and read you the parts of the paper they didn't read to you.
I'm hearing about the curators.
Pardon me?
Let's hear about the curators.
Well, wait a minute, let me ask this question.
Well, I'm curious about when you talk about an audience. My background is at the Field Museum in Chicago, and I would argue that there's another audience in addition to visitors that's the donors. So a lot of times I feel like a lot of the exhibits are built with the donors' anticipations in mind, and that really doesn't always have anything to do with the visitors. How does donor...
Well, stakeholders definitely include all the powers, this list of powers. And one of the paragraphs of this paper suggests that the major powerful stakeholders, which include donors, but also include political will, and politicians, include funders of all kinds, have a huge amount to do with the direction of the place. But they're the actors that I put on the team with the staff and the director's intentionality. They are coming in this direction about the shape. The users of the museum, unless you really are using a museum for the donors a lot, and sometimes I think we are doing that in some museums, are not the intended audience. They are the stakeholders from behind. They're shaping what they want, but they have intention to affect the people who are considered the users. Yeah, in the back.
Well, nowadays with, you buy a smartphone or something like that, you walk out the door, it's already obsolete by the time you get to your car. It seems to me that there's this idea in our society now that change is just automatically good or automatically the direction that we should head in. And I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate here. I mean, what would you say to someone who said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it?
I would say it's broke. On the other hand, I don't want to throw it out because the stuffness has power for us all. The question is, what are we going to do with that stuff and in the place? And why do we have boundaries, as Chris was talking about, that make what people wish to do with it so difficult in our space and not so difficult in other places? Let me go back to your smartphone because it raises, and I'll go back to this curator issue. One of the things that museums have done over the history of museums increasingly, but not necessarily intentionally, is that they have fused the stuff and the information about the stuff as if they own both. So the curator's role is to tell you about the stuff in a closed system, but your smartphone makes that an obsolete issue. That is, I can find out about any stuff by opening my smartphone. I hate my smartphone, but there it is. I have an iPad with me. I can find out anything I want to find out. And what museums are going to, in this list of 6 things, be responsive to is how can they decouple the content and the thingness in order to allow people to go deeply or superficially, or in what kind of way can they do that? There is a place in the classicist sense that we own things that are essential. I mean, systematics in natural history museums are housing the DNA of extinct species we can get nowhere else. So it is not without value, the classic institution. But the two streams have always happened at the same time. In the United States, the first museum, which was bought by P.T. Barnum, and there was simultaneously with this notion about the Cabinet of Curiosity, this notion about the object as spectacle. The Thomas Cole exhibitions went on tour, and you paid a nickel and you pulled the curtain, you got to see it. So it isn't, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It is, this tension has existed historically forever. So if you read the history of museums, if you read John Cotton Dana, he is talking in the face of classicist museums about museums of inclusion, and he creates the museum in Newark to be different, but he's coming out of that impulse. So it isn't quite as simple as, we got this and why are you messing with it? We have both of them all the time. Yeah?
Do you see examples where you see a correlation with strategies of board composition leading to better inclusion for these institutions?
Board competition?
Board composition. So like, who makes up the board of directors?
Oh, you bet. You bet. in the National Museum of New Zealand and in the National Museum of the American Indian, there is by statute numbers of people, in one case Maori people, in the other case Native people of the United States, who must be on the board, and without them the museum would be hijacked into a direction in which their voice would be much more difficult to hear. So, and it was put in by statute for that very purpose. That is, the people who are the descendants of the objects were terrified that voluntary board composition wouldn't take place. You want me to read you about curators? Someone, yes.
I was wondering, have you had the opportunity to take an adult to their first museum, and what kind of museum did you take? Classicist or inclusive?
Somebody say again, closer for me. You'll notice I have these things in my ears. So, what is she
She's
asking?
asking if you would ever have the opportunity to take adults to a museum for the first time, and if it was a classicist museum or an inclusive museum.
Well, I take grandchildren. They get increasingly older. My oldest grandchild is 16. Museums are what we make of them. And the question is a complicated question because they're going with me. And all of a sudden their experience is a very different experience because I'm not taking it from the institution. Oh, this is my daughter-in-law. We've been through many museums. We're recalibrating the experience in any way we want because I'm not afraid of the institution. So the question is more properly to ask, have you ever watched novice people enter the museum with terror, which was the story of my life at 14 when I went to the Museum of Modern Art and was followed by the security. That's a very different experience where you don't feel you have permission to redo the experience in a way that is personalized for the people that you're with. And if you watch that, and I would suggest you all watch that, that is, watch some family enter a museum for whom museum experience is not their life experience, and this is the first time in this museum, and watch their discomfort. You will begin to see the kinds of organizational structures you need to do to share that, to make that possible for them. And it's many things, it's not one. Judy Rand is sitting here in the audience. She is arguably the most important and famous label copywriter in the United States. And she's the person who invented that we could change the tone of the label copy from teacher to unwilling student to buddies. So that's just a tonal change in the same system. The label looked like the label. I can't remember what word you used that I was so goop or gup in Monterey.
Oh, goop.
Goop. Goop. What is this goop? I said, what? That's a decision, a tonal decision about the museum. There are hundreds of small decisions you can make about what's the language level, what's the expected reading ability, what's the alternate languages we can provide, what's the amount of information here, how are we going to make it possible for families with very small children to get in and get out and do something entirely different with this exhibition than we've done? Why is there no food in the middle of this? When is the coffee maker showing up? I mean, the Borders brought us coffee and books together, and no library now is without a cafe. Before that, you couldn't possibly, because, rats would come and they would eat the paper, but now it's okay.
So I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to go out and have the reception, and you'll have a chance for informal questions there.
Yes?
What is a student? But I'm, yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
I'm really interested in the way you've positioned the inclusionary museums, ranging from community, ethnic specific, community specific, and how they're so much the instigators of change. Also that you coupled it with the force of a director, a visionary director. And I wonder if you see any kind of support or means of support for the rise of individuals like that within the system and the support of this collective that might really advance the field.
It's an interesting question. On the one hand, there are funders who are trying to support leadership development. So there's the Getty and the Noyce and things like Fulbright's. On the other hand, there's a lot of, back to the person who wanted to talk about the board, there's a lot of demand on certain political specters to do the opposite of support them. If you look at the history and trajectory of people-centered museums, especially community museums, they tend to move to the right because the funding comes from the right. On the other hand, the funding sources are in different streams. So some museums cynically go to both ends, but they don't mean it. But other museums, their protectors are in certain locations. I think we've made the worst possible case to governments about the importance of public museums, and mostly I think of it in some ways as our own fault. But they fund libraries and public parks, which they see as the citizens' right, and they don't think what we do is the citizens' right because we haven't made it the citizens' right. And so in some ways they're correct, in some ways not. I think we have a lot of work to do to keep negotiating that, but to also make it clear. I like to think of museums as the inclement weather playground. Free is a very big, important thing. There are lots of governments playing with free and charges and who comes and who doesn't come when it's free and how do they use it. The most vulnerable of the museums among us are the community museums, without question. The most used, most diverse museums among us are zoos. Thank you, everybody.